Okay, this is Unit G, Part 2. This part of the unit, we're looking at transport of substances across the cell membrane. So key ideas in this screencast are that substances, for us to survive, must move into and must move out of our cells all the time. A perfect example of this would be oxygen, has to move in every day into every cell. Carbon dioxide, the waste gas, moves out of our cells, every cell, every day. And substances are going to get into and out of our cells both passively, so no energy required, and actively, meaning it's going to require, must have ATP energy. So some key vocabulary words, we just mentioned passive and active. Again, passive meaning it's going to use the gradient. It's going to move passively down the concentration gradient, and it's going to happen without the input of energy. Active transport, we must have ATP available. If I'm talking too fast, pause it, get caught up, and then carry on with me. Diffusion is going to be a specific example of passive transport. Diffusion is going to be the movement of particles down the concentration gradient. And concentration gradient is a word that we need to understand. If we don't, it's going to be tricky for us. And concentration gradient, always is comparing two sides of a membrane when we're doing biology. So we would say, if this is the membrane in the middle here, on this side, there's a high concentration of these particles. On this side, we would say there's a low concentration of these particles. There is a gradient from high to low that exists. So high means there's more particles in one area or on one side of the membrane as compared to the other side of the membrane. And that is a concentration gradient. So some more review chemistry, if you're not having chemistry in your background. A solution is made up of two parts. The solvent is going to be, in all biological systems, it's going to be water. So solvent is the part of the solution that dissolves the solutes. And so if I, like we did with our gummies, we made salt water. Water is the solvent, and the salt, when I throw it in there, got dissolved. It is the solute. So salty water is a solution. It's made up of the solvent and the solute. So along with the idea of a concentration gradient and solutions, we need to understand that we can talk about solutions as being dilute. And when we're talking about dilute, we're talking about the solute in the solution. So if we say this is grape Kool-Aid, right, I put in less grape Kool-Aid to make a dilute cup of Kool-Aid, or I put in more Kool-Aid, more scoops, and I made a concentrated batch of grape Kool-Aid. So this would be more concentrated. This would be more dilute or less concentrated. Another visual on this, and again, this idea, this would be, we could think of this as a gradient from high concentration to low. And what we need to understand along with this is that when I have less solute, this is more watery, more concentrated in terms of water. So where it is dilute in terms of solute, it is more concentrated in terms of water. And the reverse, and this is not to be overstated, it is very important for osmosis. Here, this is more solute. It would be a lower concentration of water. Okay? So when we're talking about concentrations, we're not talking about water. We always are referring to what is dissolved in the water, the solute. So again, back to the main focus of the screencast is comparing passive and talking about the 3 examples of passive transport. Just a reminder, passive transport is going to be the movement of particles across the membrane. So we're talking about across our cell membrane here. We're not talking about around a room, around a house. We're talking about across a cell membrane, okay? And it's going to be a movement of particles either into or out of the cell without the use of energy. And an example provided before at the start, oxygen moves into our cells without energy. Carbon dioxide moves out without energy. In contrast to this, the movement of particles across the cell membrane, sometimes it's going to require energy. It's going to need energy, and we're going to call this active transport. And for active transport, I'm going to have to use up a reminder of ATP, what it looks like, right? 3 phosphates and the base adenine. So when I see a cell membrane and a ATP molecule standing beside it, I know that this is going to be active transport. That energy is required to move a substance across the cell membrane, and again, this is active transport. So passive transport, there are 3 types that we will talk about. Diffusion, facilitated transport, or sometimes referred to as facilitated diffusion, and the specialized kind of diffusion, osmosis, which is the diffusion of water. So let's start with diffusion. Watching the particles, they're moving from an area of higher concentration if this was outside of the cell, and they're moving in. So this movement is random. So diffusion is a random process. It's not an organized process where all the particles just decide, let's all run inside. Particles are moving. They're in movement all the time. Particles move around. So movement of particles happens in both directions. However, diffusion is the net movement of particles down the concentration gradient. So in this unit, we're talking about a cell membrane. We're not talking about diffusion in a classroom, diffusion in a swimming pool, or you're in your cup of tea. It's always, we're talking about it across the cell membrane. So it is going to be the movement of particles, the random movement of particles down the concentration gradient. So it's not organized, it's not focused, they're moving randomly, and at the end of it all, after a while, particles are going to be more or less evenly distributed. So moving on to an example, as I mentioned before, would be oxygen diffusing into our bloodstream. It moves passively, it moves down the concentration gradient. Carbon dioxide leaves our bloodstream, enters our lungs, and this is the CO2 that we exhale in the respiratory system. It leaves our bloodstream and diffuses into our lungs. So this happens passively, no energy required. Second type of passive transport is facilitated, and this is going to be diffusion through a protein channel. So diffusion of particles through a protein channel. So similar to diffusion, because particles are moving from an area of high concentration outside, and it could be high inside, but they're moving from an area of high concentration, in this case, to an area of low concentration, and they're moving through a protein channel. So the difference between diffusion and facilitated is, in facilitated, they use a protein channel. An example of facilitated transport that happens in our cells is how glucose moves into our cells, and we would say glucose moves passively through a protein channel into our cells. This is facilitated transport. The last example of passive transport, and the one that we will spend the most amount of time on in class, is the diffusion of water, and this is the movement of water down the water gradient. So what confuses people about osmosis is that we have two things in a solution. We have a solute and we have a solvent. And so if there is a higher concentration of water, the water will move down its gradient. So in this case, and I should have used a different color, saying low solute, so the blue dots are the solutes. So say the blue dots are salt, NaCl. In this case, there's high solute, so this is very salty. This is saltier. This is a higher concentration of salt. However, we're not talking about the movement of the salt. In a semi-permeable membrane, the membrane might be impermeable to salt. So what happens, all our membranes are permeable to water. The water is going to move from high, and the red is water, so this is a little bit tricky. They should have done the blue water. The water moves from higher concentration of water. So on this side, there's a higher concentration of water than on the left-hand side. So water moves from an area of high concentration of water to an area of lower concentration of water. So water moves down the water gradient. And it's the reverse of the solute. So that's a little bit tricky, and you want to make sure you understand that. So although osmosis seems kind of removed, oxygen seems like, yeah, that happens a lot. Osmosis happens every day, very important. In our large intestine, the reabsorption of water out of our digestive tract back into our body happens by osmosis. So in this example, this is showing us a red blood cell going into three different types of solution. Hypertonic is very concentrated in terms of salt. We see that the water leaves the cell, and the cell shrivels, the cell shrinks, it loses mass. In a hypotonic, so this is hypertonic, the solution is salty. Hypotonic, the solution is the same. And is it going to finish the story for us? In an isotonic solution, it is less salty. Sorry, I confused myself. Isotonic is the same, and a hypotonic is less salty. So in a hypotonic, and I'll try to make it go again. Let me see if I can get it to go. Let's see, and then we can just watch it for a second. So in the hypertonic solution, the red blood cell goes in, and the water moves by osmosis out of the cell. Hypotonic solution is very watery. The cell goes in, and the water goes into the cell, and it's going to cause the cell to rupture or burst or lyse. In an isotonic solution, it is the same inside and outside of the cell, so the cell is going to remain the same. Okay, and if you wanted to rewatch that, we're going to go over these words though in class. So hypertonic means the solution is more salty. Hypotonic means the solution is less salty. And isotonic means the solution is the same as the cell. And that's what we need inside of ourselves to keep our cells healthy. So from this screencast, can you draw a diagram to model the process of diffusion? So you need to understand high to low concentration, and you need to understand the idea of a gradient, high to low. Particles move passively down the gradient. Can you compare diffusion to facilitated transport? So facilitated uses a protein channel. They are the same in that they both move passively. Can you explain how osmosis works? Can you explain how osmosis is just a special type of diffusion? Hope that helped.